Thanks for watching this free video tutorial, which is a free sample from our course Comprehensive Introduction to Arnold 5 for Maya. It is a massive 9-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for Maya thoroughly. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check the entire course out. Okay folks, in this lesson we'll be taking a look at the Arnold standard hair shader, probably one of the most powerful hair shader and easiest to use. So let's get started. Now this hair model that we have, you can find it in your Maya's Common browser, this one here, and you can load it if you wanted to, or you can just load the scene file for this lesson 0411 standard hair. Now the lighting, as you can see, I have this Arnold sky with an HDR image and 3 area lights. You can check out the lighting on your own. For now, let's just get back to our camera and select the hair shader. Now the render that you see in the Arnold render view is with the default shading, and now we're gonna basically assign a standard hair shader. So if you select the hair shader and go to its shape node and come down to the Arnold section here, you can see here you can define a hair shader. So let me click here and go to my Arnold shaders, and here we have our AI standard hair shader. And now we have basically assigned a standard hair shader to our hair geometry. Let me just get back. And actually, to make sure the AI standard hair shader will be applied to the geometry and will show up in the render, we need to actually make sure this override hair option in the visibility section is also checked. Now let's get back to our standard hair shader, run the Arnold render view. We just make sure 100% progressive refinement, and let's run this. Sometimes you need to actually update your scene and then run the IPR. So here is the default render that we get, and as you can see, it's really realistic and beautiful even without changing anything in the material and in the shader properties. Now up here you have this presets menu, which can be very useful. You can see you have a bunch of hair preset, including this auburn, this black, this blonde, this dark brown, this green, and this red. Let's try some of these presets. We can probably save the snap here, make sure we have defined the snapshots folder, and let's use this auburn presets and see what we get. And now we get this beautiful reddish brownish hair color without doing anything, right? You can also save that if you want to. So let's make a bit more space for the Arnold render view here. We also have some other presets, maybe try this green preset here. Okay folks, so now we have this nice green hair preset. Okay. Now if you take a look at the Arnold standard hair shader, you can see we have tons of parameters here. But what you need to be worried about, let me just close these sections here. What you need to be worried about are in the color and in the specular section. So using just these few parameters, you can achieve extremely realistic and beautiful hair shaders. If I just use one of the presets that we have, maybe this black preset to start with, and probably the most important parameter, one single parameter that can actually change the look of the hair, is this melanin value here. Let me just run the IPR again. Now basically melanin is the pigment that gives human skin, hair, and eyes their color. Dark skinned people have more melanin in their skin than light skinned people have. The melanin parameter here is used to generate natural hair colors by controlling the amount of melanin in hair. And as you can see, the amount of melanin is set to 1, and we get this black hair color. And the colors here will range from blonde at around 0.2 to red and brown at around 0.5 to black at 1. So as you can see, using just this melanin value, you can go from blonde to red, brown, and black color. As you can see, it's very convenient, and it's really what melanin does here. It really just produces natural hair colors based on the value that you put in here. Now obviously if you have a specific texture or if you want to use an exotic color, you can use the base color. So what you need to do in that case, you need to actually zero out the melanin value and define the color that you want in the base color section. For example, let's try maybe this kind of purple color here, and as you can see we get that color that we have defined as the color of our hair strands. Now let me just set the base color to the default white again and set the melanin maybe to about 0.5 for now. Now we have this base weight parameter here, and this is basically controls the brightness of the hair, and it's like a multiplier for the base color. So it's 1. If I go to 0, you can see there would be no shading, and if I start increasing this, let's say to something like 0.1, we start to get the color of our hair strands, and at 1 we get the full effect. We talked about the base color, and this color controls the color of the hair, right? And this controls the absorption inside hair fibers, which gives hair its color as light scatters around. Now down here we have this melanin redness, and this is basically controlling the redness of the hair. Now we can actually try a few redness value and see how it works. So let me just render a few version with melanin redness set to 0, set to 0.5, and set to 1, and we'll see how they will differ. In the first render, the melanin redness is set to 0. In the second one, it's set to 0.5. And in the third one, it's set to 1. As you can see, by increasing the melanin redness, we are increasing the redness of the hair shader. Okay. In this case, let's set the melanin redness back to 0.5. Now we have this melanin randomized value, and this basically randomizes the amount of melanin in hair fibers, which result in a more random hair color for the hair strands. Right now, all the hair strands that we see using the exact same melanin value, which is 0.5. But if I set the melanin randomized value to something like 1, now as you can see, we have a random melanin value for different hair fibers that we have. Okay, in this case, let's set the melanin randomized to 0. Now in the specular section we have a few important parameters, and the first one is the roughness, which controls the roughness of her specular reflections and transmission. Lower values give sharper, brighter specular highlights, while higher values give softer highlights. So let's try a roughness of maybe let's try 0.05, very sharp. Also, we'll be rendering another one with the roughness set to about 0.5, 0.6, so we can be able to compare the two render. Now, in the first render, the roughness is set to 0.05, and in the second one, it's set to 0.5. As you can see, by increasing the roughness, we are getting this kind of duller, less reflective look and softer highlights, basically. And when it's set to 0.05, we get this sharp specular reflections. Okay, in this case, let's set it to let's actually use 0.05 for now, so we can take a look at the rest of the specular parameters. Now we have IOR, which is the index of refraction, and each hair fiber is basically modeled as a dielectric cylinder with hair reflecting off and transmitting into the fiber depending on the IOR. Lower IOR values give stronger forward scattering. So if we try something like 1.1, and higher values of IOR will basically give stronger reflection. So if I try something like, maybe we can save this render and try the IOR of 2 and compare the two. Now as you can see, the result of increasing the IOR value is a stronger, sharper reflection. So this is with the IOR set to 1.1, we get this forward scattering look. And this is with the IR set to 2. In this case, let me set the IR back to its default value of 1.55. And then we have this shift value, which here the shift value is the angle of scales on the hair fiber and shifts the primary and secondary specular reflections away from the perfect mirror direction or the root of the hair strands. For realistic results for human hair, a small angle between 0 and 10 degrees should be used. Normally less than 4 would work. Now in this case, let's try a shift value of maybe 1. I think the default value here is 3. And then we take a look at the render with the shift value of about 10, and we'll see the changes here. So here is a render with the shift value set to 3, and this one it's set to 10. As you can see how the highlights are moving along the hair strands closer and away from the hair roots. Okay, so these were the parameters that you actually need to know for creating realistic hair shaders, but you have a few other parameters that let's take a look at them. So if in the tint section you have specular tint 2, and this transmission tint, and these colors are actually will be adjusted based on the melanin or the base color that you specify here. So you don't really need to change them or do anything with them, but if you want to have a customized control, you can obviously start adjusting them. First we have, let me actually come here and probably use this black preset for now. And if we just run the IPR, so we have this specular tint, which basically is the scale of the primary specular contribution and simply multiplies the primary specular color. So if you just use a color like, let's say, this kind of pinkish color, you can immediately see the color of the specular lobe has changed to this pink color. And as I mentioned, you really need to kind of stay away from these parameters because these will be adjusted based on the base color and the melanin values that you define. And we have the second specular tint, which basically is the scale of the secondary specular contribution, which simply multiplies the secondary specular tint. And as I mentioned, for realistic and clean hair, this color should be set to white to let the base color tint the reflection. So if I, let's say, use the same pink color, you can see it's a bit harder to see, but it will basically adjust the secondary specular contributions. And let me just change this to white. Now if I come down here in the diffuse section, we have this diffuse and diffuse color, and basically diffuse controls the diffuseness of hair, with 0 giving fully specular scattering and 1 fully diffuse scattering. For typical realistic hair, no diffuse component is needed. Obviously dirty or damaged hair might be approximated with diffuse scattering. So if I just start increasing the diffuse weight, you start to kind of see how it will affect the hair, right? Now obviously you can use, like for example, a noise texture to control the diffuse color, and it will be a bit more realistic when if you wanted to add something like diffuse contribution to the hair. So in this case what we can do is, let's just come here and use an AI noise. Okay, if I just increase the amplitude so I can actually see what's going on here. There you go, that's the noise we have. Let's increase the scale, probably something like 2, and maybe the amplitude can be lower. Let's try 3. And if I get back to the hair shader itself and decrease the diffuse contribution to probably something like 0.1, now we start to see that fragile, damaged look. Okay, in this case let's set the diffuse contribution to 0. And if I come down to the opacity section here, you can control the opacity of the hair, and it normally gives a more realistic, softer look if you actually decrease the opacity and use a darker color for the opacity here, but it's going to increase your render time significantly. So probably should stay at white, and if you use a color, let's say a darker color here, like for example something like this, maybe you need to actually go to the let me select the hair geometry itself and make sure that the opaque option is disabled, and now you're gonna start to get that softer hair look, but it's going to increase your render time significantly. So you should really stay away from this option unless you know what you're doing and you have enough render power. So we can control the opacity color. Let's try. Okay, so that's about the opacity. Also, we have this emission section here, which allows you to basically emit from your hair. And this is only for artistic controls, and for a physically based hair shader, you don't need to actually use the emission, and you probably won't. But if you want to create some kind of weird looks, you can actually use the emission here. Okay. And in the advanced section, we have this indirect diffuse and indirect specular control, which basically controls how much indirect diffuse and indirect specular will be received by the hair. So if I just zero out the indirect specular, you start to see that the hair shader won't receive any indirect speculars from the scene, and indirect diffuse will control the amount of indirect diffuse that will be received by the hair. Now in the extra attributes down here, you have this extra depth parameter. If I just set the melanin value to something like 0.25 to get a blonder hair color, this extra depth parameter here adds extra specular ray depth just for this particular shader. If I go to the render setting here, and in the Arnold render, you can see we only have one specular ray depth, but here the extra depth is set to 16 for this shader, and in this case we're going to add extra specular ray depths just for this particular shader. And especially for lighter hair colors like this blonde hair color that we have here, it's necessary that we have some extra ray depth. If I set the extra ray depth to 1 here, you can immediately see we get this very darker and not as physically accurate color as we had when we had the extra depth set to 16. Okay. Now, finally, to actually get rid of the noise that you see in the renders, if I just take a look at some of the renders that we have, we see some of this noise here. We need to actually increase the specular sampling, because our hair shader, as you can see, the diffuse contribution is almost always set to 0, so it's a specular based shader, and we need to increase our specular samples to get rid of the noise that we see here. The camera samples obviously would work as a multiplier for the specular sample, so if you increase this, it will work just fine, but obviously in that case you will be adjusting all the other ray types as well. So in this case, for the final render, you can probably use something like 5 for the camera samples. I can say, let's try something like 4, and I'm probably gonna use something like 5 for my specular samples as well. It's gonna probably 4 would be enough, but just to make sure we don't get any noise, I'm gonna make sure my specular samples are set to 5. Also, if I go to my outliner and take a look at my lights, as you can see, the samples for all the lights in the scene are set to 4, so we don't get any direct noise. There you go. Perfect. And for the final render, you can use different presets and different values that you want. In this case, let's go to the standard hair shader and probably use this auburn preset. As you can see, the roughness set to 0.2 and the melanin is about 0.7. Melanin redness is set to 1. Let's just go to the render setting, common, probably something like 1000 by 1500, or we can set the height to about 1200 and 800. This should be enough. Make sure the resolution is set to 100%, and I'll be back when the render is finished. Okay folks, so here is our final render with this beautiful auburn preset, and as you can see, we get this nice render. You can try out different roughness values, probably different shift values, to get the exact result that you are after. I'll be trying to save out a few other hair shaders for you. You can find them in your Hypershade in the finished version of this lesson. So that's about the Arnold standard hair, and as you can see, it's extremely powerful and it's extremely easy to use. See you in the next lesson to talk about another aspect of shading in Arnold for Maya. Thanks for watching this free video tutorial, which is a free sample from our course Comprehensive Introduction to Arnold 5 for Maya. It is a massive 9-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Arnold for Maya thoroughly. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check the entire course out.